his followers to offer these unbelievers conversion to Islam just as he had offered to the emperors. And if they refused, to offer them the opportunity to pay tribute as vassals of the Islamic State, and if they refused that also, to go to war. And he said this, according to an Islamic tradition: fight in the name of Allah and in the way of Allah. Fight against those who disbelieve in Allah. When you meet your enemies who are polytheists, invite them to 3 courses of action. If they respond to any one of these, you also accept it, and withhold yourself from doing them any harm. Invite them to accept Islam. If they respond to you, accept it from them and desist from fighting against them. If they refuse to accept Islam, demand from them the jizya. If they agree to pay, accept it from them and hold off your hands. If they refuse to pay the tax, seek Allah's help and fight them. Conversion, subjugation, or war. Those are the 3 choices that are offered by the word of Muhammad himself. Now, obviously, there are Muslims in the world today who are happy to live in Western societies, pluralistic societies, and are not at all interested in offering unbelievers conversion, subjugation, or war. But here again, because these texts exist, and because they are not dead letters that I dug out of dusty old books in a library, but are rather quoted and invoked by Islamic spokesmen around the world today, these things are being used as instruments of recruitment to place moderate Muslims on the defensive, to portray them as having strayed from the purity of Islam, and to call them back to the fullness of the Islamic observance on their basis. This has happened even in the United States. In Lackawanna, New York, there was a celebrated case a few years ago where some young men who were 3rd or 4th generation Yemeni Muslims, very, very secularized, very Americanized, they were approached by a gentleman who was, in fact, a Saudi Wahhabi recruiter. He'd been born in the United States, but had lived in Saudi Arabia from the age of 3, and then returned. And he came to these men and he said, he won them over, he got them to join a Quranic study group, and he presented it to them. Look, you're on the way to hell. You're living with your girlfriend, you're drinking alcohol, whatever. How are you going to expiate that? Well, the Prophet Muhammad was approached and asked, is there any deed, tell me the name of some deed that is greater than jihad. And he said, I do not know of such a deed. And when he said jihad, this is, of course, how the presentation was made to these young men. He did not mean a spiritual struggle within the soul of the believer. He meant warfare against the unbelievers. And he got 6 of them to go to Central Asia to try to join up with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and fight against Americans, on the basis of trying to do some great deed that was good to expiate for all the evil deeds that they had done, and invoking Muhammad and the Quran and Islamic teachings to justify this. Now, the Jews and Christians in the traditional Islamic law who agreed to pay the jizya were known as the protected people, the dhimmis. The protection comes because as people of the book they have received genuine revelations, the book, from Allah, and thus differ in status from out-and-out pagans and idolaters such as the Hindus and Buddhists in this view. Historically, the latter 2 groups were treated even worse by Islamic conquerors. The bloodshed in India was immense until ultimately, as a practical matter, the conquerors of India granted the Hindus dhimmi status, which allowed them to live, although without equality of rights under the law, within the Islamic polity. Now, the Jews and Christians and the others who have the dhimmi status may live in Islamic states, but not as equals of the Muslims. One Muslim jurist explained that the Caliph, the leader of the Islamic community, up until 1924, must make jihad against those who resist Islam after having been called to it until they submit or accept to live as a protected dhimmi community, so that Allah's rights may be exalted, may be made uppermost above any other religion. Now, this is obviously something that is completely at variance with the pluralistic model of modern Western societies, and does not at all bode well if people are fighting, as they are, to reinstitute this law around the world. It doesn't bode well for particularly the equality of rights of religious minorities in Islamic countries even now. Still, however, there is great hope for negotiated settlements. There is an increasing call, for example, for talks now with Iran. and an ongoing pressure on Western governments to initiate and consummate talks with the Palestinian Authority. Here again, Muhammad's example, I think, is very much worth consulting. And this is encapsulated by the key Islamic principles that were formulated by the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. In 628, toward the end of his career, Muhammad had a vision that he wanted to perform the pilgrimage in Mecca, but Mecca was still under the control of the pagan Quraysh tribe, Muhammad's own tribe, which had rejected his status as a prophet. And so he decided to enter into negotiations with the Quraysh to arrange for the Muslims to be able, and particularly for Muhammad himself, to be able to make the pilgrimage. Now, when he met with the Quraysh, he agreed to Quraysh demands that Allah not be invoked in the treaty, and that Muhammad not be identified as Allah's prophet. He said, write this down to the scribe, and he said, Muhammad, the apostle of Allah, agrees to this, and the Quraysh negotiator stopped him and said, wait a minute, if I thought you were the apostle of Allah, I wouldn't have gone to war with you. And he said, okay, strike it out, say Muhammad the son of Abdullah agrees to this. And he agreed to all these disadvantageous elements of the treaty. For example, he shocked his men by agreeing that if anybody fled from the Quraysh to the Muslims would return them to the Quraysh. But if anybody fled from the Muslims to the Quraysh would not have to return them. His followers were very upset about this treaty, and he reassured them, he told them that better days were ahead. Ultimately, their fears would be assuaged. A woman of the Quraysh, Kulthum, joined the Muslims at their base in Medina. Her two brothers came to Muhammad asking that she be returned to them in accordance with the agreement between him and the Quraysh at Hudaybiyah. But Muhammad refused. He actually had received a divine revelation refusing that is in the Quran today. And it says, O you who believe, when there come to you believing women refugees, examine and test them. Allah knows best as to their faith. If you ascertain that they are believers, then do not send them back to the unbelievers, which effectively broke the treaty. In refusing to send this woman back, he did break the treaty. And although Islamic apologists have claimed throughout history that the Quraysh broke it first, this incident came before all the incidents that the Quraysh invoke as having been treaty violations. Now, I mean, all those actions by the Quraysh that are supposed to have been treaty violations. Now, this set many dangerous precedents that are enshrined in Islamic law. In the first place, if you read the manuals of Islamic law, you will find that a treaty is not to be entered into unless there are two conditions. One is that Muslims are weak and need time to gather strength to fight again more effectively. Or, and this is the second one, if they have a reasonable expectation that their foes will become Muslims. Only in those cases are treaties to be entered into, and then only for a temporary period up to 10 years, renewable after 10 years, but still kept on a temporary basis. There is no provision in Islamic law for a treaty to be based on the idea that two sides are weary of fighting and want to establish peaceful coexistence in full harmony with one another. It is only on those bases. Now, I think this would be a very useful thing to keep in mind, actually, when there are calls, as there have been recently, for treaties on the part of Palestinian groups, as also from Al-Qaeda itself. But because of, I think, a general unawareness and an indifference to the elements of Islam that are being used by these pious Muslims as their guides to action, these things go by Western analysts and policymakers. They assume that these things are not really being taken seriously because they don't take them seriously. And so they miss a chance to understand a great deal of the motives and the goals and the strategies of the jihad terrorists who are working according to these principles. And this is true in the response to Ahmadinejad's letter to the president, which imitated very closely Muhammad's letters to the emperors. And this is true in the case of the treaties. And it is true in numerous other ways. Unfortunately,